Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for making the effort to join the workshop on rights-based approaches in heritage management. Um, Today we hope to flag off the collaboration between the Jindal Global University and ICOMOS India on working together for the next 3 years on this very important topic of rights-based approaches in heritage management and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have chosen to work on both these themes together because I don't think the Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved without looking at rights. So I think it'll work very well. And so the 2 days is primarily to discuss between people, the participants here from the Jindal Global University and members from the ICOMOS India Working Group on RBA, on the roadmap, that how do we want to engage with these two topics and take the work forward over the next 3 years. We've had to move the program around a little bit back and forth because we have a couple of presentations from international members from the International Working Group on Rights-Based Approaches in Heritage Management. And the focal person for heritage matters in sustainable development, within the Sustainable Development Goals, the work of the within the United Nations. So that is, so both these speakers would be joining us in the afternoon because they're 4 hours behind the Indian Standard Time. So we've had to move our schedule for the day around. Ideally, we would have liked them to be here in the morning to set the tone for this workshop, but they will be joining us in the post-lunch session. So at this point, yes, I must introduce myself. I'm Gurmeet Rai, and I'm a conservation architect and vice president of ICOMOS India. And I am on that international working group on rights as well. And this happens to be because, I've been watching this develop over the last, in fact, 10 years, this work in rights space, because a very, there's this conservation architect, Mr. Amund Larsen, Ludwig Larsen, who actually started this work in ICOMOS. And we had the opportunity to host him in India in 2007 when he came to India, and he traveled in Punjab with me, looked at some of our work. So it's very gracious of him that he says that the kind of work we were doing, it actually inspired these questions in his mind on rights and heritage management. So it was in 2014 where in the General Assembly in Florence, where ICOMOS India and ICOMOS Canada decided to support the initiative of ICOMOS Norway to take this work forward on the international platform of ICOMOS. So at this point, I'd like to invite Professor R. Sudarshan, Dean of the School of Public Policy in the Jindal Global University, to address the gathering.
Thank you very much, Gurmeet. My name is Sudarshan. I'm the Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy in the Jindal Global University. It started in 2012, so we have 7th year of that school. I'm particularly pleased to be associated with this initiative because I worked for some 22 years in the United Nations Development Program, and I was part of a group of the UN institutions that met in May of 2003 and formulated what is called the common approach to a rights-based approach to development. So all the UN agencies were represented in that meeting in May in 2003, when there have been previous developments in terms of, although the human rights is in the charter, there was no clear articulation for all of the agencies as to what human rights meant for their work. So Food and Agriculture or WHO or ILO, they did their thing, they had their agenda, but, and there was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And for a long time in the UN system, there was no consensus on what are the rights that are enforceable, that are binding on member countries. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has all the rights, but to make it binding, it had to come in the form of a convention or a treaty, which countries could sign up to. And what happened because of the Cold War was that the Western countries and so-called liberal democracies signed up only to civil and political liberties and did not think economic, social, and cultural rights are human rights. Whereas the Soviet Union and countries in the Soviet bloc, the socialist countries, felt that the priority ought to be on economic, social, and cultural rights, that people who are hungry are not going to write poetry and engage in artistic expression, and therefore they were unwilling to sign up to civil and political liberties. With the result, the UN decided to draft two separate covenants, one on civil and political liberties and the other on social, economic, and cultural rights. And the voting on these and the parties that became countries that became parties to these covenants divided on Cold War lines. So it wasn't until 1991 in a UN organized conference in Vienna that this divide was broken and there was a consensus among all the member countries, because by that time in 1991, 1989, the Berlin Wall had fallen and changes had happened, so the Cold War in a way ended. And so in 91, there was a declaration that all these rights, civil and political liberties, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, are one set of indivisible rights, and there is no hierarchy among them. The earlier rationale offered by the Western countries was that civil and political liberties were rights that entailed telling the state, lay your hands off, don't interfere. So freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom to practice your religion. In all of these matters, the directive to the state was don't interfere. Individuals can do what they please. Whereas if you said economic, social, and cultural rights, it involved right to education, the right to food, the right to health, the right to shelter. All of these require an outlay of resources on the part of the state for the right to be meaningful. And so the understanding in the UN system was that these rights would be progressively realized and that states are duty bound to allocate the maximum possible resources for these rights. So this is a distinction that Sir Isaiah Berlin drew as an Oxford academic, which influenced the Western countries. In other words, he said that if you have rights, you must have enforceable remedies. And so it's easier to enforce a remedy such that the state has interfered with freedom of expression by having censorship of the press, so the state should remove censorship of the press. That's an enforceable remedy through a court. But if you said that every child must go to school, has a right to an education, that means there must be schools available and teachers available and so on. So that's not so easily enforced. So in our constitution, we have enforceable rights, which are the fundamental rights in part 3 of the constitution, and the social and economic and cultural rights are actually in the directive principles of state policy, which say that they are not justiciable in a court of law, but they are nonetheless fundamental in the governance of the country. So this is the background. So after 91, when there was this consensus among all member countries of the UN, then the question arose, okay, we now say, okay, human rights are indivisible, The first clause, that all human beings are born equal in dignity and in rights, is meaningful. Then how do you translate that into the work of different agencies and in things that we do? So it was in 2003 that the UN agencies got together to formulate what is called this common approach or a common purpose statement on a human rights-based approach. So what it entails is, firstly, to say that there is one set of people who are the bearers of rights. So you have to identify who are the bearers of rights and what rights do they have. Of course, the rights that are there in the Universal Declaration, not all of them are in the two covenants. For instance, the right to a holiday, for instance, is there in the Universal Declaration, but it's not part of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So the Universal Declaration itself is much broader, and the enforceable part, which is binding on all the states, is somewhat more narrow. So the first principle is you must identify rights bearers, but equally, whenever you have people holding rights, correspondingly, there are people who owe a duty to those who have the rights. So now the duty obligation is primarily on the state, but not only on the state. It also, there are obligations for non-state actors as well, as duty bearers towards those who have rights. So the important principles of human rights are that it's universal, that it applies to everyone, everyone has rights, that it's and correspondingly the duty bearers have an accountability obligation. So a rights-based approach essentially entails, in practice, what it entails is to look at who's left out, who are the disadvantaged groups. So when you say a rights-based approach in this UN terminology, it doesn't mean, okay, if you just said, oh, everybody has rights, everybody is on the same footing, then it doesn't become very practical in certain contexts. You've got to know what to do in certain situations. And so the primary focus then becomes, for a rights-based approach, to look at who are those who are left behind, who are the weak, who are the marginalized, who are vulnerable, who need a voice to be able to assert their rights. And so this principle of equality becomes very meaningful because, as we know, the world is not equal. People are placed in unequal situations. The elites in all countries generally get their way. And so in a rights-based approach, you're not so concerned about what is it that the elites want and wish to have. Although in principle, of course, they have the same rights, but we have to look at who is disadvantaged. And one large category that in all walks of life, because of all religions being patriarchal, are women. So there has to be a very clear focus on what do you do about women and gender. So that's one. And then various other forms of discrimination that people face, whether it's in terms of ethnicity, race, or in our country, caste. These become important considerations. So you have to prioritize the rights of those who are in these situations in a rights-based approach. The other point then is practically you have to empower people to assert and claim their rights. And this is where rights-based approach becomes meaningful, especially if you focus on those who are discriminated against or have been disadvantaged. You need to empower women to assert and claim their rights. So there's a whole set of things that we can do to empower the rights holders to claim their rights. But equally, we need to focus on the duty bearers. So say which is institutions of the state or some quasi-state or even NGOs, how to improve their capacity to be able to uphold their obligations and meet their accountability requirements. So you need a capacity development framework for both sets, the rights bearers, people who, and especially those who are disadvantaged, and for those who are the duty bearers, how to empower them to recognize and fulfill their obligations vis-a-vis the rights holders. So this is the context. So one of the things that we hope as a university to be able to do in the context of cultural heritage is this, that you identify, there may be people who are affected by decisions that are taken. I mean, the corridor from the Kashi Vishwanath temple to the Ganga may have entailed, changing the claims of and rights of people who've been living in that city, in that passage, who have rights. They have a right to shelter, they have a right to property. So they are rights bearers in that sense. Now the authority that implements this is the authority that bears the duty. So you need to have a capacity development program for both sets to be able to get a fair outcome in such situations. So in the end, the objective of a rights-based approach is really justice, right? I mean, because the opposite of poverty is not really prosperity. The opposite of poverty is justice, because poverty is an injustice. And so we need to look at it like that. And so we hope as a university to come up with some training modules and a capacity development strategy for both sets of actors, the rights bearers as well as those who have a duty and an accountability obligation towards those who have the rights. So that's why we are in it. And so in this is a area where, we as a university or as a school, the School of Art and Architecture headed by Tom Michael, would have, domain knowledge of what it means to protect and conserve and monuments and the habitations and people around those and livelihoods of people which are part of an intangible cultural heritage. And we from the Public Policy School can develop modules for capacity building, getting institutions to work better. And the capacity building program really entails institutions getting to know who there are in the institutions. Most of our institutions are very top-down, and there is a general presumption in policy, for instance, that our policies are good but implementation is bad. So the policymakers, pat themselves on the back saying they've developed brilliant policies which don't work, and when they don't work, they blame another set of actors who are supposed to be lower order people implementing the policy who have not understood the policy. Now, obviously, a policy that's not implemented is by definition not a good policy. So you need to figure out how is it that in an institution you get everybody to pull together, everybody understands the goals and the purposes and so on. So we can have a serious effort in terms of the institutions that are involved in cultural heritage and help them develop their capacity to be more responsive to the claims of rights holders. So that's why we are here. So thank you.
Yeah, I just thought maybe we should do one quick round of introductions and then we can...
I'm the second of three deans involved in this collaboration. Thomas Michael, the Dean of Art and Architecture, Global University. We're a relatively new program, but we also overlap with the expertise of everyone in ICOMOS, as you were saying, having to do with a deep knowledge of architecture and its social context. The third member, Kathleen Madrowski, is not here, so I'll speak for her for a moment. Her School of Liberal Studies and Humanities also has a lot of expertise in everything from social innovation practices to working with local communities, and a relatively robust range of researchers who are adept in different forms of social science and social research methodology. So that's another part of this approach, is to try to use not simply case studies and data, but also develop rich and robust research methods across disciplines so that we can come up with more resilient solutions. So there's a missing person here, but she'll be at other meetings. Thank you.
Good morning all. I'm Komal Poddar. I'm a conservation architect and I'm a consultant with JSAA. And I was involved in the first exercise of rights-based approach which happened 4 years ago. So I'll be giving a short introduction of that as well.
Good morning everyone. I'm Priyanka Singh. I'm a conservation architect and an independent practitioner based in Delhi. I've been a part of ICOMOS since 2015, and while this is a subject that sort of speaks to my heart, it's not something that I've engaged with intellectually, and I look forward to the conversations.
Hi, my name is Jindal Global University and senior photographer.
Hey, I'm Bhuvana. I'm a faculty in the Jindal School of Public Policy and Government, and I'm an architect. My basic training is in architecture, but now I teach largely in public policy. In terms of the topic that we are dealing with, I deal with property and how heritage management, kind of tangentially, how heritage management policies and conservation policies affect the property rights and therefore the livelihoods of people, craftsmen and artisans.
Good morning all. My name is Radhika Dhumal. I'm a conservation architect. I have practice in Delhi called the Architectural Studio, and I was also formerly consultant to the Archaeological Survey of India. I have been involved since last 4 years. When Komal did her first study, 2 of my sites which I was working with were included as case studies. So that's why I'm back here. But in between, I've done some work which I think unknowingly sort of raises these questions of rights, and that is why I feel that it's very important to take some action along with what we do as professionals in making policies and making management plans and so on and so forth. So that's why I like to engage here and probably take this forward for the next 3 years. Thank you.
Environmentally and in urban planning issues, and much focus on heritage legislation, and as well as any delisting is done, protested. We convince the government, go to media, and we protest. When final loss result, if nothing is done, then we go to the court, the public interest litigation. Roughly out of 25 issues we addressed, 21 issues were successful. 4 were some failures. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ishita Jain. I'm an architectural historian, and I focus on methods-based investigation of history. So currently working on documenting non-canonical narratives that are present in stepwells in central Gujarat, and designing community engagement around it, because that's why I'm actually interested in the rights-based approach, because there are smaller stories around how communities engage with what's present as heritage without calling it that, and there are beautiful forms of revitalization that happens when that happens. So what we just heard about empowering people to recognize the value-based systems that they have is something that we work with a lot, and developing methods around that approach. So more than production of content, I focus on developing methods to produce that content. Thank you.
And a bit about your
apart from doing this, I also teach architectural history at university in Ahmedabad, and that's as part of my research practice, we currently conducted a workshop which is called Ghosts That Walk the City, and where we engaged architecture students from undergrad to take on this canonical heritage walk that is an identity of the city of Ahmedabad. And like, we've been taking that same walk for 20 years to talk about the identity of the city of Ahmedabad that has been perpetually changing. So this was a way to interact, to get the students to engage, what changes have come about, how those changes do not reflect in the stories that are being told about that walk, and how built environment is objectified to become heritage, and only beautiful buildings are heritage, but the stories of the craftsmen that have made that building, or the stories of resilience of the women who run that entire economic quarter, or what happened when the earthquake came, what happened when the riots happened. All of that is embedded in the built environment, but the canonical narrative does not allow for that to shine through because there are vested agencies. So that was the project that we did with the students. So as a rule, we participate with students, so nothing we do happens in isolation, and try to bring in universities and educational institutions into this engagement, and presented this work as an exhibition of visual narratives. And at this great place, Conflictorium, which is a museum of conflict run out of a Parsi lodge that has its own scandalous history. But it's a great place. Thank you.
I don't think I can match that. It's very good, very interesting. I'm an excise officer, worked in the field of heritage management and tourism for a long time, and now with ICOMOS. Thank you.
Good morning all, I'm architect Shilpa Jain. I have special interest in economics of conservation. I do believe that without the economic factor or the angle, conservation is just an elitist movement. And based on that, I think the rights-based approach in heritage management is very important, and I'd like to see where the two meet. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nupur. I'm an architect working in conservation field with Gurmeet ma'am in her firm. The reason why I wanted to attend this workshop and understand about rights-based approach towards heritage management is because throughout our childhood, living in Delhi, I've met so many people who are living near monuments or near heritage structures, and their opinions about whatever I am doing right now or whatever I'm trying to speak to these people about, that you shouldn't be in any way harming the heritage, is always met with a lot of conflict, because their ideas about their rights towards that particular area, their neighborhood, is very different. And I always end up having some sort of argument, or probably losing the argument, because their understanding towards their rights towards that area, they feel like it's their property. So that's why I'm here.
Good morning, I'm Rishabh. I'm an architect. I recently graduated in 2018.
I'm Alicia. I'm a recreational architect. I'm right now pursuing my master's in recreational architecture. But to understand recreational architecture, one needs to understand the basic rights, because recreation obviously comes after the necessities. So it's very important to develop a recreational spot, be it in a heritage monument or anything. One needs to understand the rights based accordingly.
Hi, good morning. My name is Pankaj Machanda. I'm actually running a startup now. It's a new use case that I'm working on, which uses augmented reality and analytics to really enhance the visitor experience at World Heritage sites across India. And we have additional mandates in school outreach program. There's a school outreach program that we have to sensitize school kids about their heritage sites and how it's important. We try to basically link it to their curriculum. It's not only history, so it's a multidisciplinary approach that we've evolved. And the third spoke is community on board, which we would want to evolve to build a sustainable tourism model. So through the walks, which will now be scalable using technology, we would want the community to be on board. So that's what we're working on. So I'm a new member to ICOMOS and just trying to understand what the entire landscape looks like so that the learning can be built into the project, so to say. Thanks.
Hi, I am Ritika Khanna. I have a master's in World Heritage and also a master's in art history. I'm currently working on an independent study on World Heritage site management in India. So I'm trying to figure out that what are the sort of loopholes in World Heritage management or just heritage management in general that could cause threats to human rights. So issues related to climate change, to the role of local communities, to the rights of indigenous people. Is what I'm looking to learn and also hopefully be able to contribute something. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's a very interesting mix of people. So now we're ready to start our first session of the day. And we begin with a presentation by Ms. Priyanka Singh on the Delhi Declaration on Heritage and Democracy.
So I don't have a visual presentation, but I'll just be speaking about the Delhi Declaration and how it came about in 2017. So the Delhi Declaration on Heritage and Democracy was an outcome of the Triennial General Assembly held in India in 2017. The Declaration's focus on heritage and democracy develops from the fact that it was the overarching theme of the scientific symposium of the General Assembly. The theme was explored through three sub-themes, namely integrating heritage and sustainable urban development by engaging diverse communities for heritage management. And the second being the role of cultural heritage in building peace and reconciliation. And the third being protecting and interpreting cultural heritage in the age of digital empowerment. Under each of the themes, technical papers and posters were presented during the scientific symposium over the course of 2 days. It was this dialogue, discourse, and debate in the build-up to the scientific symposium and during it that the Delhi Declaration came to shape. It's the first body of work as a doctrinal text which has been led by ICOMOS India and subsequently ratified by UNESCO at the World Heritage Committee. I will walk you through a few of the important aspects of the Delhi Declaration. It opens with a statement that says, the Declaration reflects the commitment by ICOMOS to heritage and democracy as key ingredients in people-based approach to sustainable development. Heritage is a fundamental right and responsibility of all. It is a starting point for meaningful and equitable future that secures and celebrates diversity, social engagement, equality, and justice for all cultures. It makes a call for all.
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure. Right. Is this better? I should just speak. Let me just speak. Sorry. The Declaration specifically makes a call to all stakeholders of heritage, practitioners, government agencies, individuals, and communities, and seeks all to make commitments on 4 accounts. The first being to manage heritage resources for our common future. The second, to develop ethical principles and education for managing heritage resources. The third, to promote inclusive, democratic, community-engaged processes. And the fourth, to ensure and respect the continuity of living heritage, where it particularly makes a mention of heritage conservation as a condition for sustainable development and our future. Under each call for action, the Declaration emphasizes integrity and authenticity of heritage as paramount and aims to broaden the focus on not one type of heritage, but including all tangible, intangible, natural, and particularly highlights living heritage and continuing traditions. It also speaks of the rights and duties of all members that it makes a call out to. Traditional custodians, government, practitioners of all that heritage encompasses. Thank you. Short and crisp.
So the Delhi Declaration is on the ICOMOS website. And Sujata, is that something which is accessible by everybody? It's on that open, it's not, you don't have to be a member to access that document, no? That's an open document on, okay. So basically, ICOMOS India has a website. Maybe at some point Sujata can even show that. And it's password protected by all the members, especially the dialogue between members and things like that. No, but certain documents are open for everybody to look at. So the Delhi Declaration on Heritage and Democracy is there on the general page. Yeah?
It's even there on the main ICOMOS page where all the declarations and charters are listed.
So ICOMOS International,
Yes,
their
yes.
website. Okay, great. Any questions, or should we move to the next presentation? Is that okay? So the two presentations that we have before the lunch, which is at noon, one is by Komal on the previous work of ICOMOS India on the rights-based approaches. And the second presentation is going to be by Ms. Radhika Dhumal on periodic reporting cycle of World Heritage properties. Now, just a brief background on what Komal is going to be presenting. Like I said, that Mr. Amund Larsen began this initiative on the rights work, and this was supported by the government of Norway. And at some point, this is the number of years she's going to talk about that, they wanted a certain number of case studies from the ground of World Heritage to be able to highlight the issues related to rights. So ICOMOS India was asked to look at, we were primarily required to do 1 or 2 heritage sites. One, the Western Ghats. But we took upon ourselves that we were going to look at more than one. So Komal's going to walk you through the findings and the methodology that we worked on. Yeah. So can we switch off some of the lights here, please? I don't think it's very visible. Just these ones near her screen, the front ones.
Am I audible? Yeah, okay. So, thank you, Gurmeet ma'am, for the introduction. And I think I'm going to touch upon a few points that was mentioned by Mr. Sudarshan here about how to ascertain rights and what are the rights of the duty bearers, and how to improve on capacity and fulfill the obligations, and how it is all about a top-down approach and which can be addressed by policy implementations. So we have the format of rights, but how they are not being implemented on ground. So, as introduced, so this project was primarily to study the World Heritage context and convention in terms of how rights are being addressed in terms of the legislation framework. And so the underlying philosophy that we formulated in terms of how the rhetoric should be defined, not only in cultural, social, historic, scientific, as not only in the cultural context, but also social, historical, scientific context in terms of the existing World Heritage framework. So the methodology that was formulated was to identify and redefine the identification of heritage and how can a site be documented in terms of intangible and tangible aspects, and what is the need for formulating a narrative with respect to heritage, values and rights and context of a site. Then we went upon studying the operational rights regime in terms of how a site can be defined adequately and appropriately in terms of its quality, value and context, and how people play an important role, and how that can be defined in the already established conventions of rights and cultural rights as well as human rights. So this is So as you can see, we selected 5 sites, out of which 1 is a natural site, which is the Western Ghats. 3 were cultural sites, which one is Champaner and Pavagadh, which my colleague Radhika will elaborate further on. And the second was the Mahabodhi Bodh Gaya, which is again a cultural World Heritage Site. And the third was Sri Harmandir Sahib, which is not a World Heritage, which was withdrawn before its nomination. So the reason, the fifth site was Kanchenjunga, which is a mixed site. The reason why we selected these 5, because there were different aspects to each of it, and we had developed a matrix of studying these sites in terms of its legislative framework, in terms of its the people that are associated, and in terms of its cultural values, and trying to find out the gaps which may be addressed through the regime of rights in the context of World Heritage. So the main objective is to devise methodology of this study was to build capacity to support rights-based approach and identify the good practices and the loopholes in the existing framework. So when we went about how to document a site or how to look or study at a site, we majorly talk about the tangible aspects, which is the built heritage, so which is architecture, the material culture, design art, and traditional knowledge systems. And the aspect of intangible may or may not be addressed or documented, which talks about the political setting, the social practices, and the knowledge behind what forms the heritage and the culture of a place. So this study, basically, we had a good group of multidisciplinary experts, which involved architects and social anthropologists and museum experts as well. And this is how we went about trying to define a site in terms of its timelessness, in sense how it can be achieved by weaving together stories and myths which are passed from generations, passed to generations. The second is about how the character of the places undergo huge transformations, and heritage can be maintained and preserved in the global context. I think you touched upon the thing of conflictorium, so I think this is also one aspect. Then how the transcendental value of the heritage property transcends from a local level to a global level, and what are the foundational values of that site in terms of its OUV. To talk about rights, there are 3 different aspects of rights. One is the substantive rights. So these are the basic human rights, the fundamental rights. The statutory rights are supported by law, and the conventions are basically rights and treaties that are adopted by state parties, but not binding by law, but they're in principle. So like Mr. Sudarshan expressed about how the Cold War influenced the convention rights. So the cultural rights are forming a part of the convention rights. So in terms of the convention rights, the literature distinguishes between 3 levels of obligations of the state. One is to respecting basic human rights, which requires policy guidance and encouraging the state-led World Heritage activities. The second is to protect human rights, specifically requiring the state to protect individuals and groups against human rights. And the third is to fulfill the state party and action and facilitate the enjoyment of rights. So these 3 are the major obligations that we need to, the duty bearers need to uphold and fulfill. So in terms of measuring the potential value of the site and studying the site in terms of its context of World Heritage, OUV, and the indigenous people or rights, the value in terms of its immovable heritage, the aspect of society and the continuity of change and participation and legislation are the 3 main parameters to study any heritage context and to address issues regarding heritage framework. So we had actually, this was a secondary study, and there's a lot of literature already being written in terms of rights, and there are some aspects in which I think in the next study that will be commissioned, we need to study all these aspects in terms of individualism and collectivism, that how collectivism is a moral stance and political philosophy and ideology, and this the majority of the heritage sites should be framed under collectivism owing to the link with nature, culture, communities, and it should benefit all. So to move on to defining cultural rights, the United Nations Declarations on Right on Indigenous People, the UNESCO Declaration Principles on International Cultural Cooperation. Each of them mention that how indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their culture and traditions, and how each culture has a dignity and a value which must be respected and preserved. So the reason why these already established principles and declarations were studied as to form a basis of the study and the case studies that were being analyzed further. And in terms of identification of gaps, so the concept of safeguards, which comes under purview of international development banks such as World Bank and EDB. So amongst them, the cultural aspect is only viewed as a physical cultural resource, but the realm of intangible is not really considered. So out of the three parameters of management framework, the cultural aspect has to be strengthened further. So I'll touch upon the case studies that were carried out. So I'm going to elaborate the case study for Western Ghats. Like I mentioned, there were 5 case studies in which we took up 3 cultural, one which was a natural, which was a mixed site, which is the Kanchenjunga, and one the Western Ghats. So the interesting case about Western Ghats is it's a serial nomination, and it spans across 4 states. So as you see here, it spans across the 4 states of India. And it has got 39 properties, which comprises of 7 subclusters and chains of mountain, and it has sanctuaries, national parks in the states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Goa, and Maharashtra. So it's 5 states. And so it was listed under natural criteria 9 and 10. And it has identified tribal communities which are endemic and indigenous, and which also are dependent on the forest produce of these sanctuaries and national parks. So we have developed this evaluation and assessment matrix. So I'm just going to talk about the different ways in which these case studies were evaluated in terms of the basic description of site, which talks about its values and why it has the OUV to become a World Heritage. And so the site of Western Ghats has around. So the tribes which are found are the Todas, the Solikas, the Halakis, and these are indigenous community which are dependent on the forest produce. So to study to talk about the criteria for inscription, the state of conservation report and specifications of UNESCO nominations. Here, these aspects are what has been laid down with the World Heritage Convention. The major part which was part of the study was to analyze the legislative framework and the framework of institutions and regulatory provisions, and how at different levels. So like it was mentioned earlier about how the top-down approach is. So there are different legislations in terms of the national policies, regional policies, and local levels, and how these stakeholders and duty bearers are conducting their responsibilities on site. Whereas it was also found that to put together these legislations, these were addressed in the assessing of the loopholes, and to find out what are the good practices and what are the missing links between the legislative frameworks. So just to explain, is this visible? Okay. Just to explain, we highlighted the critical issues which were flagged by the UNESCO and IUCN before inscription. So in terms of Western Ghats, it was mentioned that out of the 39, there were 4 more sanctuaries which did not have a buffer, so they had to be dropped. So this was in case of regulation and in terms of the management framework. Before inscription, there was this panel which was at the Western Ghats Ecological Committee, which was headed by Madhav Gadgil, and it was a detailed study as to how the Western Ghats should be protected and the area should not be reduced. Whereas another report came in which was headed by by Kasturi Nangan, which says that to reduce the protected area, and it should be only declared as a special ecological zone. So there are these conflicts in terms of management. And the third conflict comes from the state parties, in which the states have their own agendas in terms of development. So it was observed that the state of Goa wanted to withdraw because the region in Goa was very rich in mining. So how a World Heritage World Heritage what do you say? World Heritage identification has implications on the development activities and how the states would not be supporting it. One more finding was that the recommendation of the the Western Ghats group was to, just a sec, give me a minute. Okay. So one of the major things was to defer all World Heritage nominations of sites where indigenous people territories are found, and to defer nominations to call on the respective state parties to consult and collaborate with the indigenous people. So it was found in this study commissioned by Madhav Gadgil that the indigenous people and the tribes found in the Western Ghats were not consulted, and their rights in terms of the forest produce were compromised. So, and another was to endorse the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and use it as the basis reference for framework when decision of World Heritage of Indigenous Territories is issued. So these are the basic findings. Another analysis of the operative rights regime was in terms of the traditional forest dwellers, the Recognition of Forest Rights Act, in which it mentions about right to hold and live in forest lands, community rights, right to ownerships. Whereas it was also found that when the area or when the World Heritage was being nominated, the protected area, so these rights or the indigenous people were not consulted, and very few community claims were being registered as opposed to individual claims. So individual claims in terms of the interests of the states for development activities. Further to the nomination and the state of conservation, it was also examined by the World Heritage Committee to facilitate the increased engagement with all stakeholders and build awareness and support and foster participatory governance approaches and ensure equitable sharing of benefits. So these are also coming from the World Heritage Committee to examine the current state of conservation and to address the rights of the indigenous people staying within the World Heritage. After analysis of the 5 case studies, we kind of touched upon these main recommendations as to define the property beyond the set framework, which I mentioned in terms of how a site should be also spoken about its cultural but intangible aspects. So the nomination processes of site of World Heritage brings out the fact that within the domain of defined criteria, the underlying values of sites are often neglected. So for example, in case of Kanchenjunga National Park, which is nominated in the criteria 3, which bears a unique exceptional testimony to cultural tradition. So the cultural tradition of Buddhism is found in this World Heritage Site, but these metaphysical and cultural spiritual aspects need to be delved in detail through secondary as well as primary sources. The second observation through analysis of case studies is the values and significance of cultural landscapes, and which needs assessing of important cultural significance with nature. So in terms of Western Ghats, like I mentioned, the need to describe the location of the site with respect to geography, and in terms of how the indigenous people have used it as a cultural landscape and not only as a natural landscape, and its relation to the surroundings and stories and myths associated with it. The third is to analyze the existing legislations and its effect on heritage values. So in terms of, again, the Convention of Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expression, which talks about the principle of respecting of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Economic value of nature and biodiversity and independence of community, again, similar. So these were the few inferences that were laid. Need to alternative frameworks of internalizing the heritage management in true sense with respect to theories and philosophy elaborated in this research. Need for management systems to safeguard rights, to identify gaps in existing framework, introduce relevant amendments, policies, guidelines to address the issues, and to identify points of intersection within the existing framework, and need to form a need of an orienting body to further examine issues to safeguard these rights. So this is further open for discussion then. Thank you.
Thank you, Komal. I think that was very comprehensive, and I think this report, Sujata, you've been able to upload it on the UNESCO, on the ICOMOS website, the one that I sent to you on the rights. That's also available, the report. Is that accessible by everybody or just the members? That's also accessible. So this particular report that emerged out of this study can be accessed on the ICOMOS website as well. In fact, it's as architects, we love to work with tables and flow diagrams and all that. So we've tried very hard in that particular report to be able to put our information and research material in that particular manner. So I think it's just that when we do these studies, there's a sense of helplessness after we complete the study. So when we finished the study, we said, okay, it's a nice looking study. It's good to share on the international platform. But now what next? So, I mean, it gave more a feeling of a vacuum than a sense of fulfillment that we've kind of done this study. The entire study was based on just secondary information. We did not visit the sites. It was very good to have this interdisciplinary dialogue. We had a meeting with our partner in this particular project was the Wildlife Institute in Dehradun, which is the Category 2 Center for UNESCO. And we had, so it was an interesting learning thing, but we do hope that where should we go next from that study is what we can achieve in this 3-year program by way of operationalizing some of these ideas or training modules and really get down to, even if it's inch wide, but we need to go a mile deep. While this gives an interesting broad view, we do hope that in this partnership of ICOMOS India and the Jindal Global University, that we can go that mile deep, even if you pick up one particular aspect of operationalizing an idea.
Yeah, can I say something about that?
Yes, please.
Because I requested the last set of images, because whenever we get a clear outcome that indicates more work needs to be done, frameworks need to be engaged, different stakeholders, yeah. All of those recommendations you called inferences are actually what we want to workshop tomorrow and make those as articulate and detailed and committed as possible. So what you're saying is aspirational. Tomorrow we want to make operational.
So the next presentation is by Radhika, and this is going to be because of her quite a long experience working in the Archaeological Survey of India, and I think her work has been, your nomination dossier that you prepared for Champaner was while you were part of ASI, or was that separate? That was a separate initiative.
That was in 2000, the year 2000 to 2004. I was involved, but more like a student, and then
so that engagement was before your work with Archaeological Survey of India.
Yeah,
so we're kind of separating
before.
the two.
Yeah.
Okay. So over to Radhika. Do you need 25 minutes? Is good for you?
15 minutes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Gurmeet, and thank you everyone for. So this is going to be a very worded sort of thing, but I just want to explain what this process of periodic reporting is. Periodic reporting is one of the statutory sort of monitoring process in the World Heritage Convention, which it has a cycle of every 6 years. And the first one happened in 2003, the next one happened in 2012, 13, and now the next cycle is going to be in 2022. Is going to be evaluated that time in World Heritage, in the World Heritage Committee. This is one of those periodic reporting it's a cycle where each World Heritage site managers have to write the state of, so this is the process. How it works is that there is, it gets announced first that there's going to be periodic reporting in so-and-so year, and there are 5 regional, obviously all World Heritage sites are divided into 5 regions, and it happens regionally. And so India falls under Asia Pacific, And then there's the submission, the reports are actually online now since 2012-13. It's been online where there are a set of questions and that is answered by the site managers, usually the WII or the forest department or for natural sites, and ASI or the local archaeological department in case of cultural sites. In mixed sites, it has to be both. So this gets submitted and the World Heritage Center actually organizes this whole thing. It's a year-long sort of time period through which this whole periodic reporting happens. And when I joined the ASI in 2010, this had just begun for 2013. And sorry, I'll just finish this cycle. Then they happen to they have regional reports and then they have regional workshops to discuss what the issues are. And interestingly, when it became online in 2012, it started giving results at the same time. So you fill up this long 80-page report online indicating what the situation on site is, and it will give you a immediate reaction of, what is the answer. So that was sort of a challenge because kuch galat bhar diya idhar and then something is coming out which we don't want. So that is what, but that's obvious. But I think this year they have become smarter and the state parties will not know the results before. I hope that happens in the third cycle. Anyways, then there are regional action plans. So each region, like Asia Pacific has a regional action plan and also the issues registered. And then implementation over the 6 years of all the gaps that need to be built in for the management of the World Heritage property. This is the process that the periodic reporting, and that cycle takes its own time, basically 1 year for preparation of the periodic reporting and then the 5 years to sort of cope with it and try and get things done. And so in the 2012 experience, that's the second periodic reporting cycle that happened for the World Heritage properties in Asia Pacific. The main things to look at was assessment of the application of the World Heritage Convention, which is usually the section 1 of the World Heritage property, which is usually, I think, once you have to do the section 1. And then assessment of whether the outstanding universal value of the properties inscribed on the World Heritage list is being maintained over the time. Some of our sites have been inscribed in 95. So this also required a lot of updating. So in the second cycle, there was an opportunity to update whatever information was missing, all the situations have changed. And so it's like sort of a continuity of monitoring the site. And then mechanisms for establishing and enhancing regional cooperation. So many sites have, even in India, the regions and the issues may be same, but we don't discuss it. So there was a platform. And then when it is a sub-regional, then we also look at Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan. Of course, the Pakistanis don't come usually, but we had these interactions with these different state parties who came in as site managers and discussed their sites. And then the implementation of the convention, I think, is what they look at while they do this periodic reporting. Now, the next cycle, which is the third cycle of periodic reporting for Asia and the Pacific, is going to be, as I said, in 2022, which gives us these 3 years to prepare for it. Of course, the organizations who are going to be the focal points are going to take on this work prior to 2022. So one needs to look at things quite immediately, I think, because the announcements would have been made in the 43rd section of the World Heritage Committee. So it has, for example, it is an online online submission from the site managers directly. But there is this this is the kind of questionnaire that they have. They have these multiple levels of ticks that we have to make. And surprisingly, in this third cycle, I noticed that they have local communities, which is new. I don't know, should I go? How do you? Okay, this doesn't work. But if you look at, there is local communities have been added. ICOMOS International has been added. ICOMOS National, ICOMOS Regional, IUCN International. All these bodies have been engaged. Groups and institutions involved in preparation of the periodic report. I won't say section 1 because, but what I'm trying to say here is that periodic reporting can be a platform to engage with the kind of change or monitoring that we would like to do for our World Heritage properties. So the second cycle of periodic reporting for which I was engaged in the ASI was an extensive exercise where we had this training for almost 6-7 days in the WII Dehradun, where it was a sub-regional for training in retrospective statements of preparation of retrospective statements of outstanding universal values. Like I said, there are some sites which have been inscribed in 1995 or 80s or whenever the sites, they don't have, it wasn't as organized and there was nothing digital about it. So we had to look at many retrospective situations and then write the outstanding universal values, rewrite them. But as we know, the operational guidelines changes every 1 year, 2nd year, 3rd year, every 2-3 years it's been changing. So retrospective meant that you look at the criterias while you write the statement of outstanding universal value, you're looking actually at the older operational guideline, or the year that it was inscribed that year. So in retrospect, we had to rewrite this, which was a task because it was to look for the right operational guideline, and then, it was quite a task. And then there was section 1 and section 2, which was an online questionnaire, which had a deadline that it would stop working when the deadline gets over, and you'll totally miss it. So we all had to sort of, work with. The section 2 was basically on state of conservation, and so the site managers had to fill that directly, and we had to assign, each site manager had to be informed, assigned, given the authority to actually look at this whole thing. And the third aspect was cartographic. We realized, or the World Heritage Center realized, that they don't have enough cartographic information about the sites. In the older or even the newer, like even Qutub Minar required cartographic information because they didn't have a proper total station survey. They did not have all these sort of issues were there where they could not identify where the boundaries are. So that had to also be done in retrospect. So for which we had to do a lot of surveys and sort of also in some parts make minor modifications to the boundaries. So it was so there were all these processes that were put in place for this during the second cycle of periodic reporting, which was quite intensive. Then in Suwon in Korea, there was a sub-regional workshop after post the whole cycle finished. After the reports was made, there was again an action plan where all the site managers were invited, or not all the site managers, but the focal point or one representative was invited, and I also represented the ASI at Suwon. And the 4 core issues that came up in the whole region, which I don't think is right to generalize, but I think they remain. And one of the 4 is that there's an importance of greater community involvement and benefit sharing. This, for whatever reason, is a lack in this region, completely. But above that, there are these management issues and what are they? Disaster risk and regional cooperation. So in Suwon, there was a draft action plan which was prepared on the 5 strategic objectives of the World Heritage Convention, which is conservation, capacity building, credibility, and where is it? Yeah, these are the 5 strategic objectives. Based on that, an action plan was drafted, in which area-wise it was given. So the sub-region was divided into western and central, south, southeast, northeast. And so India falls under south. And there were some things that the issues which remained in each region, this is what was deciphered. But of course, what action had to be taken was up to individual state parties to take forward. So VTRAP, which is another category 2 center for culture and natural, I think now, they had taken this initiative to try and follow up with the state parties to actually engage with them and follow up with the periodic reporting cycle too. But I have no idea of how much of that has been. I left the ASI in 2015 and then I stopped following up with that. But now I'm getting back to it. But the impact, the number of sites which had to follow this sort of draft action plan was almost 22% of the World Heritage sites during that period, and over 200 sites. And of course, these were the 4 big main issues, and I think we would definitely, if we engage at this level, we will definitely be able to elaborate on the community involvement and benefit sharing and sustainable funding mechanisms probably, and regional cooperation. So why I totally believe in this periodic reporting and trying to engage with this for the RBAs, because we have this time right now, which sort of fits into this 3-year thing. The platform in its operational guidelines, I was reading the operational guidelines this morning, and there was an article which said that it allows and encourages for the rights-based approach to look into this sort of a process of monitoring a World Heritage site. And our objective of community involvement and benefit sharing could be impactful at this level. And the next question is, how do we plug into this platform? Like, who'll ask us that? Why should we? Of course, the government organizations will think, pain. No, don't get there. But we will have to network with the WI and ASI and other organizations. If they ask for, they will have to ask for our assistance and help, which I think will never happen. But because the RBA working group is already engaged with the World Heritage Committee, so to say, they could invite us to take, to stick our foot in the door and say, no, we will be also doing this work and you'll have to listen to us. If maybe we could take a few World Heritage sites. We already I've written 2 because I know of 2 and I'm engaged with 2. But there are issues which, when we get onto the individual sites, we will realize that there are practical issues, and there is a need to sort of look into the people and look at how we can help them, and capacity building would be a part of this whole process. And I think also a little bit of advocacy may be required to push this whole thing about, because in this region this is a lack which is prevalent and which needs to be addressed. So I think slowly and steadily find sort of a platform to get into this platform, sort of find a link to get into this platform and engage constantly with it would probably be helpful for us in India, I think. Thank you.
We have 7 minutes.
I got an email, lunch is served.
Oh, good.
I wanted a general discussion on this. One of the difficulties in the UN system is pinning down what are cultural rights. Economic rights, you can talk about, right to work, universal basic income, all of those things. So social rights, non-discrimination, access, and so on. But when it comes to cultural rights, you see there is a tension between human rights being individual focused, and culture is not individual focused, it's collective. And this tension is not easily resolved. I remember there was a human development report on cultural liberty, which was published in 2002 or 3. and Amartya Sen wrote the introduction to it. But Amartya is an individualist, so he writes about it as a matter of individual choice. Whereas there are communitarians who would disagree, would say that, you know, your person's identity is given by relationships and the community to which that person belongs, and this idea of the individual self, which is a very Kantian kind of understanding, is not widespread in the world. In many parts of the world, people don't have that kind of identity. So cultural rights has always been ambiguous. So when you're talking about rights-based approach, it's very well to say, okay, individual-based rights, it's easier to deal with, but when it comes to collective groups and their rights, group rights, now the Indian Constitution is somewhat unique because it recognizes group rights. When we have provisions in the Constitution for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, these are all rights that are granted to groups in the Constitution. So in that sense, it's there, an understanding. But in terms of the work that we do here in the world in which you're working, I'd like somebody to take up the challenge of writing something that clarifies what are cultural rights. It's there in the convention and so on, but it's glossed over. It's not taken seriously. And there's one young scholar who began to work on it, Vijay Kumar Nagaraj, who unfortunately, he worked with MKSS and TIS and in a human rights organization in Geneva and then in Colombo. And he died in a motor car accident in 2017. So this is a question that Vijay had posed, which I'm posing again because I have not seen a clear explanation as to how do you get your head around cultural rights. I think it's important that we should do that.
I think that's going to be a very difficult task. Even to define culture is a very difficult task. So cultural rights comes later. But I think too, as a working definition, what she's pointed out is the community's involvement and benefit sharing. I think that would be a sort of more workable, doable kind of thing, that the communities that are involved or living or impacted by the site, they are involved and they share the benefit of it and they understand its value. But to get into this definition, I don't know these architects, if they can produce a definition of culture, because so far nobody has.
You know, I think that will oversimplify it by just looking at benefit sharing and community engagement, because if you were to look at intergenerational rights, because even as an architect, my biggest problem, if I look at the kind of work that is happening on heritage sites today, the compromise on materiality, you're actually infringing on somebody's rights, because there's a complete, like in the Red Fort, layers and layers of cement concrete in pathways, archaeology being removed and things like that. Now where does that come? It's somebody's right to their heritage, which is intergenerational right. Commodification of heritage and interventions in buffer zones. You know, you're talking about recreational architect. And I'm glad she's asking these questions, that what rights are we talking about, you know. So I think it's important to define some, even, I'm not saying we need to, I don't know, I mean, I'm not in that space to say how to define cultural rights, but I do feel that there are certain parameters we want to work with, which clearly is not just benefit sharing. It's more than benefit sharing. So whether we start with trying to define cultural rights, or we define the areas within which we choose to first engage with, and then step back and see, are we in a position to define cultural rights?
Yeah, I think that was a better approach, that you define the area you want to work in, and from that cull out. But if you start with trying to define a very specific term, and a very difficult term to describe, we'll get very lost. So I think all the things that we want to touch upon, which Komal and Radhika pointed out, a few of them, from there we can take a next step, I think.
There's more clarity with respect to, you made a reference to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples don't generally have the institution of individual rights. Land is owned by the tribe or the community, it's common property. So it's easier in that case to say, here's a sacred grove, this grove is sacred because a community that's indigenous to that location regards it as sacred. And you can have judgments like the Supreme Court did with respect to the Khond mountain and the bauxite plant, to say unless the communities living there give their consent, Vedanta can't start a bauxite mine. It's with respect to tribal people and indigenous peoples, it's easier because it's there. I mean, their whole sense of thing is collective. But when it comes to our urban centers and urban communities, I mean, you say community benefits, but what is the community? You see, we can't just assume that there's a holistic group with the common interests that constitute the community. Our communities get very conflictual and very divided, and in a sense, I mean, Ambedkar called the understanding of a village community, which as a cesspool of communal division and discrimination, right? So even the village, it's not a community. So therefore we do have some challenges. It's all very well to say nicely rights-based approach, but in every context, we have to grapple with what is it that, that meets the standards of a rights-based approach.
Also, talking about community, in the case of the Golden Temple for World Heritage nomination, the people in Amritsar, or the people who are directly engaged with the day-to-day care of the site, they were okay with the nomination. But the people who actually stopped the process was a group of people sitting in London who wrote to the World Heritage Committee that this is going to be compromising, this is Government of India's way of interfering in the workings of the sacred site. Now the point is, who defines that community? UNESCO, without taking into cognizance exactly who these people are, what are their antecedents, what have they been, because they were involved in human rights abuse in Canada, of some sort, when there was political, problems in Punjab in the 80s and the early 90s. So whether they should have been even heard, to legitimize their letter, which then came to us to respond to their observation, whether that was community. That's a very, very, I think we can't avoid agreeing on certain definitions, because I don't think you can take your work forward without defining. Now, I don't have the answers, but I do feel that we need to arrive at a certain accepted definitions to take this work forward.
Not a question, but just one of the learnings that I gained during my university days is in the 2001 UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, one of the article mentions that every individual has the cultural right of free access and enjoyment and participation in culture. So maybe if we take this basic definition of cultural right, maybe the task would be to see how communities perceive culture and how does one provide that access and enjoyment and participation to that culture. So, the interlinkages between what is culture for whom, how do communities perceive culture, and what are their rights that can be integrated could be one of the points that we could think about.
have a question. The question is for Radhika. What happens after the periodic reporting? Like, does it affect the state of conservation, or what is the decision taken from World Heritage Center? Like,
so one important aspect, if you read my slide, was that they wanted to see what are the changes every 6 years. So that was the main thing that happened. But
Okay.
periodic reporting, once the action plan was drafted, it was up to the state parties to accept or not accept. And also look into, so there was specifically like South region in the Asia Pacific, India comes under South, South Asia. And so we had specific issues which were highlighted in the periodic reporting cycle, that these are your issues and deal with them. And then they had some suggestions. There's a huge booklet which was produced about what all different examples of what all people have done to solve these issues. And I don't know whether, but this is definitely like it is a monitoring, it's like a key, what do you say, key monitoring exercise, I think maybe. So they will have this data forever, and they will keep checking and back checking. So 2002 we hardly gave any data, but in 2012 we gave a lot of data to the World Heritage Center, and they could decide whether whether we were, the site had the did it still follow the World Heritage Convention, whether the state party followed the World Heritage Convention, whether in many cases in natural, I think that their base data was incorrect when they submitted in their 80s. So now they are struggling with getting into danger. That no, in the 80s you told us that there are 350 rhinos, and now there are only 550 rhinos, or whatever number. So they are struggling with these kind of things because the nomination dossier, whenever it happens. So now in 2012 there was an opportunity to correct that data, which was in many cases done. And so it happened in retrospective. So they got a stock taking in the 2012, and now from the time that they have taken this data, they will every year keep improving the way they ask these questions. So maybe it has become 100 pages now, and there are many more questions based on it. But there was a huge working group which worked on this preparation of the periodic reporting cycle form, and they all came in every region to figure out whether they are putting the questions right. And for the state party, it was a very simple exercise. Click here, in, out, threat, no threat. It seemed like a very simple exercise. But if you ticked one of those, what is your answer going to come? Was not something we would know. But they were all questions which were entangled almost. Okay, if you have this, then you will have this problem, and this is how it has gone down from the last time. Oh, good. So I think it's up to the state party to take it up.